All right, so let's dive into this question that seems to pop up every so often in Canadian politics. Could Alberta actually leave Canada?
Hmm.
And what if they brought some friends along? Like, what if British Columbia and Saskatchewan said, "Hey, we're in too. Let's create a whole new country."
Right.
We got some really interesting articles from you guys on this, and it gets complicated pretty quickly.
It does. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it seems so unlikely in the current political climate.
Right.
But just thinking about the what ifs, it takes you down this rabbit hole of Canadian law
Oh, yeah.
and international relations
Oh, yeah.
and even like American history.
Wow.
There are some interesting connections there.
That's a real deep dive.
Yeah.
So, okay, first things first. Let's imagine Alberta, BC, and Saskatchewan all get together, and they're like, "Yeah, we're forming our own nation." What would even be like the first step?
Well, before we even get into like legal battles or drawing up new borders,
Right.
we got to think about the people, right?
Yeah.
You would need really, really strong grassroots movements in each province
Oh, yeah.
with political parties that are totally dedicated to this cause.
Wow.
I mean, can you imagine the campaigns, the debates?
Oh, yeah. That would be something else.
It would just totally upend the political landscape.
I'll call it.
And then ultimately it would come down to referendums in each province.
Referendum. So, like, that's a pretty serious vote.
Right.
Yeah. Like, you think a simple majority would be enough to kind of get this whole separation process rolling?
No, not a chance.
Really?
For the rest of Canada and the international community to even take it seriously,
Right.
those referendums would need to show overwhelming support. Like,
Right.
we're not talking like 51% here.
Mm.
It'd be more like, think back to Quebec's sovereignty referendums,
Yeah.
where even like a near majority wasn't enough to trigger any big constitutional change.
So it has to be a very clear result.
It would have to be a very clear result, yeah.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, the people have spoken, and they're like, "This is it. This is what we want."
Right.
And there's this clear mandate to leave. Like, it can't be as easy as just saying, "Okay, bye."
No, you're right.
Right.
That's where we get into some seriously mind-boggling negotiations.
Oh, boy.
We're talking about untangling decades
Oh, yeah?
of shared resources and infrastructure and finances.
Oh, yeah.
Think about healthcare systems, pension plans, even the military. Like,
Wow.
who gets what?
Wow.
And then there's the whole issue of natural resources, which is a huge part of this conversation.
Oh, right. Especially with the oil fields. I mean,
That's-
that alone would be a huge battleground for negotiation, I would imagine.
It would be massive, yeah.
And what about things like currency? Would they
Yeah.
create a new currency? Would they stick with the Canadian dollar for a while?
Right.
What about trade deals, international recognition? There's so many pieces to this puzzle.
And we haven't even talked about the legal side of things,
Oh,
which is a quagmire. Yeah, Canada's constitution, unlike some other countries, doesn't have a clear exit clause for provinces.
So this is like uncharted territory.
It would be totally uncharted territory,
Wow.
probably leading to years, if not decades, of battles in the Supreme Court.
Okay.
I mean, we might even be looking at international arbitration.
International arbitration. What does that even mean?
Yeah. Well, essentially, it means bringing in a neutral third party,
Okay.
often an international organization,
Right?
to help settle legal disputes between states.
I see.
It's usually for like really complex international issues,
Hmm.
but something like this where there's just no clear legal precedent in Canada,
Yeah.
it could very well end up there.
So even if there's like overwhelming public support and they somehow manage to figure out this incredibly complex web of negotiations,
Right.
there's still this like massive legal question mark hanging over everything.
Exactly. There's absolutely no guarantee that the Canadian legal system would even allow this to happen.
Right.
Even if all three provinces were totally united
Yeah.
in their desire to leave. I mean, it would be a constitutional showdown of epic proportions.
Wow.
With potential consequences for, like, the very fabric of Canada.
Okay, so splitting off as a group of three is already sounding like climbing Mount Everest, basically.
Yeah.
But what if we take this a step further and we imagine Alberta's like, "You know what? I'm going solo.
Okay.
I'm going to try and join the USA." A Canadian province becoming a U.S. state. Talk about shaking things up.
Now that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
Because it's not just about what Canada would allow.
Right.
It's also about what the United States would be willing to accept.
Oh,
So it adds like a whole other layer of complexity.
oh, hold on. The U.S. would have to actually agree to let Alberta in.
Yeah.
It's not like they could just declare themselves the 51st state.
No, definitely not.
Okay.
Joining the U.S. is not a one-sided decision.
Right.
Alberta would need to convince the U.S. Congress and the president that admitting a whole new state is actually in their best interest.
So they'd have to, like, make a case for themselves.
They'd have to make a compelling case.
Like, hey, we've got all this oil.
Right.
We've got a strong economy. Hardworking people take us. You won't regret it.
Exactly.
But even if the U.S. is like, yeah, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a ton of hoops to jump through on their end, too.
Absolutely. The process for admitting new states is laid out in Article 4, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
And it's not a quick or easy process.
I imagine not.
Alberta would have to show that they meet certain criteria, like
Okay.
having a functioning population that supports statehood.
Right.
Then they'd need to draft a state constitution that lines up with U.S. law.
Oh, wow.
It's a big undertaking.
So it's not just about, like, drawing a line on a map.
Right.
They'd have to completely change their legal and political systems
Yeah.
to match the United States. And what about things like taxes and currency? Would everyone suddenly be paying in U.S. dollars?
Exactly. Adopting U.S. laws and taxes, switching to the U.S. dollar.
Wow.
It'd be a massive economic and logistical undertaking.
It's like a total system overhaul.
Yeah.
Politically and economically, it makes you wonder, has something like this ever happened before? Has any other territory ever, like, petitioned to become a U.S. state under these kinds of circumstances?
Well, there is a really interesting historical parallel. Back in 1845, Texas joined the U.S. After being an independent republic for almost a decade. And that was a complex process with its own political and economic considerations.
So could Alberta just, like, look at Texas and be like, hey, they did it. Why not us?
Well, it's tempting to think that way.
Right.
But it's important to remember that the world's changed a lot since the mid-1800s.
Oh, yeah, of course.
The geopolitical landscape, international relations, even the global economic system.
Right.
Everything's different.
Yeah.
What worked for Texas back then might not fly today.
So even though there's this historical precedent, it's not as simple as just copy and paste.
No, it's much more complex than that.
Right.
There's so many nuances to think about, so many potential roadblocks.
It seems like we're just scratching the surface here. Like there's so many things to consider.
There are.
And so many potential issues that could arise.
Exactly. And remember, even if Alberta manages to do all of this, convince Canada and the U.S., sort out the legal hurdles, revamp their whole system, there's still this huge question of
whether it would actually work.
Exactly.
Like, would this massive transition be smooth? Or would it be absolute chaos?
That's the big question.
Right. And I think that's where we should pick up in part 2 of this deep dive.
Yeah.
We need to look at the reality check for both of these scenarios and really unpack the challenges and considerations
I think that's a good idea.
that are waiting on the other side of this hypothetical border crossing.
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, even if Alberta manages to, like, jump through all the legal hoops and negotiate, you know, the terms of separation, there's still the whole question of practicality.
Right. It's like planning this incredible journey, but forgetting to check if the car even has gas.
Exactly.
We talked about the potential for, like, chaos.
Yeah.
But what are some specific challenges that could come up if Alberta actually tried to break away or even, you know, join the U.S.?
Well, for starters, let's think about the economic side of things.
Okay.
A big shift like this would definitely send shockwaves through the financial markets.
Oh, yeah.
Investors get really nervous when there's a lot of uncertainty.
Right.
And this would be uncertainty on a massive scale.
So we're talking potential hits to investments, stock market volatility, maybe even a credit downgrade for Canada as a whole.
Exactly. And then there's the impact on trade.
Oh, yeah.
Canada really relies on trade between provinces.
Right.
And Alberta is a big part of that.
Huge part.
Suddenly, businesses would have to deal with new tariffs, customs regulations, maybe even border checks.
Can you imagine?
Imagine the delays, the added costs, the logistical nightmares.
It's like taking this well-oiled machine and just throwing sand in the gears.
It would be a mess.
And what about industries that are really specific to Alberta?
Right.
Like, how would this affect the energy sector, which is so important for their economy?
Well, the energy sector is a perfect example.
Okay.
You've got pipelines that are flowing freely across provincial borders.
Right.
But suddenly they'd be facing international regulations.
Wow.
Existing contracts could be challenged. New trade agreements would have to be worked out.
It'd be a whole renegotiation.
It wouldn't just impact Alberta's oil and gas industry. It would ripple out to the entire Canadian energy market.
So we could be talking job losses, price hikes, even energy shortages.
Potentially. Yeah.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is.
It does. And speaking of interconnectedness, we can't forget about the everyday lives of people.
Oh, yeah.
On both sides of this hypothetical border.
Right.
Families with members living on opposite sides. People who work in one province and live in another.
Right.
Their lives would be turned upside down.
Completely disrupted. And what about pensions?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
People who have worked their whole lives contributed to the system.
Right.
What happens to their retirement funds if the province they've been paying into suddenly doesn't exist anymore?
That's a huge question.
Right.
And one that would likely lead to years of legal battles and negotiations.
Oh, for sure.
It's not just about dividing up the existing money. It's about figuring out how future pensions would be managed,
Right.
how contributions would be transferred, and who would ultimately be responsible for making sure people get what they're owed.
It's like this giant financial puzzle with millions of pieces, and no one knows what the picture is supposed to look like.
Exactly. And in the midst of all this economic and social upheaval,
Right.
there's another really important layer we can't ignore.
What's that?
The rights and treaties of Indigenous peoples.
That's right. You can't forget about that it's not just about provincial or national borders.
Yeah.
It's also about respecting the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous nations. So what kind of challenges could arise in trying to reconcile all these different perspectives and legal frameworks?
Well, a lot of treaties were signed between Indigenous groups and the Canadian federal government.
Right.
So if Alberta were to separate,
Yeah.
there'd be big questions about which level of government would be responsible for upholding those treaty rights.
That's true.
And how those agreements would be honored in this new political reality.
Right. And it's not just existing treaties.
No.
What about land claims that are being negotiated right now?
Yeah.
Or historical injustices that are still being addressed?
Right.
Would those efforts be, like, jeopardized?
It's a real concern.
Or would they fall under a completely different legal framework?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something that would need to be carefully considered.
It seems like even these hypothetical scenarios force us to think about some really real and sometimes uncomfortable truths
They do.
about the complexities of our political and social system.
Absolutely. And to be honest, we've only just scratched the surface of the challenges here.
I was going to say this is just the tip of the iceberg.
We haven't even touched on things like potential social unrest, the strain on public services.
Right.
Or the psychological impact of such a massive change.
It's true. Just imagine the anxieties, the divisions, the feeling of uncertainty.
Yeah.
It would affect every aspect of life.
It would be everywhere.
We could be talking about an identity crisis, not just for Alberta, but for all of Canada.
Exactly. It really highlights that secession isn't a simple solution to political or economic problems.
Right.
It's a process that's full of challenges, risks, and unintended consequences.
And those consequences could last for generations.
Absolutely.
It's clear that we're not just talking about redrawing lines on a map.
No.
We're talking about potentially reshaping the very fabric of a nation.
That's a good way to put it. And while this specific scenario might seem far-fetched, it gives us a really valuable opportunity to...
You know, it's kind of wild how just thinking about Alberta possibly leaving Canada can bring up so many complicated issues.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how much we just kind of assume will always be there.
Yeah,
Like all the systems and structures that hold our societies together.
We're taken for granted.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that this whole conversation goes way beyond Alberta.
Oh, for sure.
We're seeing these separatist movements and debates about autonomy popping up all over the world.
It's a global trend.
It is like Scotland, Catalonia. Even some parts of the U.S. have been dealing with this idea of breaking away.
It's true.
Why do you think that is? What is it about this point in history that's making these movements so prominent?
Well, I think there are a few things going on.
Okay.
Globalization is definitely one of them. As the world gets more interconnected,
Right.
it creates this tension between wanting to keep your local identity
Okay.
and being part of a global economy.
Right.
Some regions feel like they're losing their culture
Yeah.
or that their economic interests aren't being represented well enough at the national level.
So it's like trying to find that sweet spot between holding on to what makes you unique,
Right.
but also being part of something bigger.
Exactly.
But globalization can't be the whole story, right? There must be other factors too.
Oh, absolutely. Economic disparities are a huge part of it, too.
Okay.
If a region feels like it's being left behind economically,
Right.
or that the wealth and resources aren't being shared fairly, it can lead to resentment and a desire to have more control over their own future.
So it's about having a say in how resources are used.
Yeah.
And feeling like you're actually benefiting from the economic system that makes sense. Are there any historical examples we can look to understand these movements better?
Oh, tons. History is full of examples of regions wanting more autonomy or even full-blown independence.
Right.
Like look at the breakup of the Soviet Union
Mm.
or the new countries formed in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Even the American Civil War.
Wow.
These events were all driven by a mix of political, economic, and social factors.
Right.
And we're seeing a lot of those same things at play in today's separatist movements.
It seems like this desire for self-determination is a powerful force throughout history.
It really is.
But as we saw with the whole Alberta situation, actually achieving independence is incredibly tough,
It is.
with a lot of pitfalls along the way.
For sure.
So what lessons can we learn from these historical examples, and how do they apply to the separatist movements we're seeing today?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that breaking away is rarely a clean break. It's usually messy and complicated,
Okay.
with consequences that can last a really long time.
I see.
Think about the ongoing problems in places like the Balkans or the Caucasus,
Right.
where ethnic and territorial conflicts are still going on decades after bigger states broke up.
So even if a region manages to gain independence, their work isn't over.
Not even close.
They had to build new institutions,
Yeah,
create stable economies,
right.
and form new international relationships. It's a huge undertaking.
It's a massive task, and we can't forget about the human cost either.
Yeah, that's a good point. These separations often lead to people being displaced,
Right.
economic hardship, and even violence.
It's a really serious thing.
It's important to go into these situations understanding how complicated they are
Absolutely.
and really commit to finding peaceful and fair solutions.
Couldn't agree more.
It's pretty amazing how a what-if scenario about Alberta can spark such a deep conversation
It is.
about global trends and historical patterns. So what do you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
Well, I hope they come away with a better understanding of how interconnected our world is
Yeah.
and how complex political and social change can be.
It's not simple.
It's easy to get caught up in the hype of these movements,
Oh, yeah.
but we need to look beyond the slogans
Okay.
and think about the potential consequences, both good and bad.
So it's about thinking critically,
Yes,
asking the tough questions,
exactly.
and realizing that there aren't always easy answers.
That's right. And it's also about having empathy, understanding the different perspectives and experiences that shape these movements.
Even if you don't agree with their goals.
Exactly.
It's still important to understand where they're coming from.
It's crucial for finding a way forward together.
That's a really important point. It's about listening to each other, even when we disagree,
Yeah.
and trying to find common ground.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on whether Alberta could leave Canada,
Right.
maybe the biggest lesson is that the real journey isn't about lines on a map, but about the lines we draw in our own minds.
I love that's a great way to put it. It reminds us that real understanding comes from challenging what we think we know,
Yeah.
engaging with different views, and always trying to see the world from different angles.
Well said. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive, and we encourage you to keep exploring these complex issues with open minds and a thirst for knowledge.